Emma Carter sat quietly in seat 14C of United Flight 328, appearing to be exactly what she had worked so hard to become over the past 3 years, an unremarkable middle-aged woman traveling for business, invisible among the 189 passengers aboard the Boeing 777 as it cruised westward across the Pacific Ocean toward Tokyo. At 42 years old, with shoulder-length brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses, she looked like any other corporate executive making the long journey across the Pacific for meetings that would blend together in memory with countless other routine business trips. But Emma Carter's carefully constructed civilian identity concealed one of the most distinguished military aviation careers in modern Air Force history. For 15 years, she had been Colonel Emma Phoenix Carter, one of the elite few to fly both the F-16 Fighting Falcon and the F-22 Raptor in combat operations that remain classified at the highest levels of government. Her call sign hadn't come from any dramatic incident or memorable personality trait. It had emerged from her uncanny ability to bring damaged aircraft and endangered missions back from situations that other pilots considered hopeless. Emma's military record included 247 combat sorties across 3 different theaters of operation, making her one of the most combat-experienced fighter pilots of her generation. She had flown interdiction missions over hostile territory, provided close air support for Special Operations Forces, and commanded fighter squadrons that had achieved perfect mission success rates under her leadership. More significantly, she had developed and tested emergency flight procedures that had been incorporated into Air Force training programs and had saved the lives of dozens of pilots who found themselves in aircraft emergencies similar to those Emma had survived through skill, instinct, and an almost supernatural ability to make split-second decisions under extreme pressure. But Emma's transition from military to civilian life hadn't been voluntary or gradual. It had been sudden and traumatic, triggered by a mission that had achieved its tactical objectives while destroying her faith in the military hierarchy that had defined her adult identity. During her final deployment, Emma had been ordered to conduct a precision strike on a terrorist compound that intelligence reports indicated was being used for weapons storage and operational planning. The mission had been executed flawlessly from a technical perspective, with Emma's ordnance hitting the target with surgical precision that eliminated the terrorist threat while minimizing collateral damage to surrounding civilian structures. But post-mission intelligence had revealed that faulty information had led to the strike on a facility that, while used by hostile forces, had also been providing medical care to local civilians who had nowhere else to turn for treatment. The investigation had cleared Emma of any wrongdoing. She had followed orders based on the intelligence provided, and her execution of the mission had been textbook perfect. But the knowledge that her skills had been used to destroy a facility that was providing humanitarian aid, even if that aid was being provided by enemies, had shattered her belief that military service was an unambiguous force for good in the world. Emma's resignation from the Air Force had shocked her superiors, who had been grooming her for flag officer rank and eventual command of major air combat operations. But no amount of career advancement or professional recognition could repair the psychological damage that had been done by discovering that her exceptional skills could be manipulated into serving purposes that conflicted with her moral convictions. The civilian career that Emma had built over the past 3 years as a logistics consultant was professionally successful, but personally unfulfilling. Her work involved optimizing supply chain operations for major corporations, challenging intellectual problems that utilized her strategic thinking abilities but lacked the sense of purpose and immediate consequences that had defined her military service. She had deliberately chosen work that was as far removed from aviation as possible, hoping to leave behind the identity that had brought her both professional satisfaction and moral confusion. Today's flight to Tokyo was typical of the business travel that now defined Emma's professional life. Meetings with manufacturing partners about delivery schedules and quality control procedures. The kind of detailed operational work that kept global commerce functioning, but rarely felt like it made a meaningful difference in anyone's life. She had boarded Flight 328 planning to spend a 13-hour journey reviewing contracts and preparing presentations, productive but routine work that would occupy her mind without engaging the deeper aspect of her personality that military service had developed. As the Boeing 777 reached its cruising altitude of 41,000 feet and settled into the long overwater leg of its journey to Japan, Emma found herself automatically monitoring the aircraft performance with a kind of unconscious awareness that 15 years of military flying had made instinctive. The engines were running smoothly, the flight was stable, and the crew appeared to be following standard procedures for trans-Pacific operations. But at 2:47 a.m. Pacific time, as Flight 328 passed over the international dateline, Emma detected something in the aircraft behavior that made her instantly alert with a kind of focused attention that combat flying had taught her to maintain even during apparently routine operations. It wasn't an obvious mechanical problem or dramatic change in flight characteristics. It was a subtle alteration in engine harmonics that suggested developing problems that could escalate rapidly if not addressed quickly. Her military training had taught her to trust these intuitive warnings even when they contradicted official assessments or conventional wisdom. Combat pilots learned to detect threats and problems through subtle cues that were often below the threshold of conscious awareness, and Emma's survival through 247 combat missions had depended on her ability to recognize danger before it became obvious to others. As she continued to monitor the aircraft's condition while maintaining her cover as a routine business passenger, Emma realized that Flight 328 was experiencing the early stages of what could become a catastrophic emergency, and that her years of running from a military identity were about to be tested by circumstances that would demand everything her previous career had taught her about leadership, technical expertise, and the courage to act when others' lives depended on decisions that only she was qualified to make. At 3:23 a.m. Pacific Time, Emma Carter's worst fears were realized in the most catastrophic way possible. Both engines of United Flight 328 suffered simultaneous flameout at 41,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, transforming the Boeing 777 from a powered aircraft into a 590,000-pound glider with 189 souls aboard and nowhere to land for over 1,500 miles in any direction. The failure was both sudden and complete. Within seconds, the steady hum of the twin Pratt & Whitney engines was replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the sound of wind rushing over the aircraft surfaces as it began an inexorable descent toward the ocean below. The cabin lights flickered as backup electrical systems automatically activated, and passengers throughout the aircraft began to realize that something was catastrophically wrong with their flight. For most of the 189 people aboard Flight 328, the engine failure represented their worst nightmare. Being trapped in a powerless aircraft over the vast Pacific Ocean with no apparent hope of survival. Panic spread through the passenger compartment as people grasped the reality that they were in a metal tube falling toward the ocean with no engines to keep them aloft or to power the systems that might enable them to reach safety. But for Emma Carter, the dual-engine failure was a technical challenge that activated 15 years of military training in emergency procedures, system failures, and the kind of split-second decision-making that combat flying demanded. Her mind immediately began calculating glide ratios, available altitude, potential emergency landing sites, and the aerodynamic techniques that might extend their flight time and increase their chances of reaching land before fuel exhaustion made controlled flight impossible. As other passengers screamed and wept around her, Emma remained completely calm, her military training overriding the natural human response to mortal danger. She unbuckled her seatbelt and began moving toward the forward section of the aircraft, her movements purposeful and controlled despite the chaos that was erupting throughout the passenger cabin. In the cockpit, Captain David Williams was dealing with a crisis that was beyond anything his 23 years of commercial aviation experience had prepared him to handle. The simultaneous failure of both engines was so rare that airline emergency training treated it as a theoretical scenario rather than a practical emergency that pilots might actually encounter. His emergency checklist provided procedures for single-engine failures, hydraulic problems, and electrical malfunctions, but they offered limited guidance for flying a completely unpowered airliner across thousands of miles of open ocean. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Captain Williams transmitted on the emergency frequency, his voice tight with strain as he struggled to maintain aircraft control while dealing with a cascade of system failures that were resulting from the complete loss of engine power. This is United 328. We have experienced dual-engine failure at flight level 410 over the Pacific. We are declaring an emergency and require immediate assistance. But even as Captain Williams worked through his emergency procedures and coordinated with air traffic control, he was beginning to understand that conventional responses to their crisis would not be adequate. The nearest suitable airport was over 3 hours away at normal flight speeds, and their powerless aircraft was losing altitude at a rate that would put them in the ocean long before they could reach any runway. First Officer Jake Martinez, a talented but relatively inexperienced pilot who was flying his first trans-Pacific route, was struggling to maintain composure as the reality of their situation became clear. The aircraft backup systems were functioning, but without engine power, their options were limited to gliding techniques that were outside normal commercial aviation training. "Captain, we're losing altitude at 1,500 feet per minute," Martinez reported, his voice beginning to show the strain of dealing with an emergency that was beyond his experience level. "At this rate, we'll be in the water in less than 30 minutes. It was at this moment that Emma Carter appeared in the cockpit doorway, her presence both unexpected and somehow reassuring to the flight crew who were dealing with a crisis that seemed to have no solution. "Captain Williams," Emma said with a kind of calm authority that immediately commanded attention despite the unprecedented nature of her intervention. "I'm Colonel Emma Carter, retired Air Force, call sign Phoenix. I have extensive experience with powerless aircraft recovery and emergency gliding procedures. I believe I can help you get this aircraft to a survivable landing." Captain Williams looked at the middle-aged woman who had just claimed military aviation expertise that might be relevant to their desperate situation. Under normal circumstances, he would never consider allowing a passenger to participate in flight operations, but these were not normal circumstances, and any source of relevant expertise might be crucial for saving everyone aboard. "Colonel Carter, we've lost both engines and we're losing altitude rapidly," Williams explained quickly. "Our emergency procedures don't provide adequate guidance for this type of failure. What do you recommend?" Emma's response was immediate and comprehensive, drawing on years of experience with aircraft emergencies that had demanded unconventional solutions and techniques that weren't taught in standard pilot training programs. "First, we need to optimize our glide performance by configuring the aircraft for maximum lift-to-drag ratio," Emma began, her military training allowing her to think systematically even under extreme pressure. "Second, we need to identify the nearest suitable landing site and calculate whether we can reach it using emergency descent and energy management techniques that aren't part of normal commercial procedures." As Emma moved into the cockpit and began assessing their situation with a kind of methodical analysis that combat flying had ingrained in her, Captain Williams realized that this passenger might represent their only hope for turning an impossible situation into a survivable emergency landing. But Emma also understood that saving Flight 328 would require her to use every skill she had developed during 15 years of military service, techniques and procedures that she had spent 3 years trying to forget as she built a civilian identity that was about to be tested by the most challenging flight of her entire career. As Emma Carter moved into the cockpit of Flight 328 and began her assessment of their desperate situation, Captain Williams experienced something unprecedented in his commercial aviation career: relief at transferring operational control to someone whose expertise exceeded his own. The simultaneous failure of both engines had created flight conditions that were outside normal airline training, but Emma's calm confidence and systematic approach suggested knowledge that might be crucial for their survival. "Captain Williams, I need you to declare that I'm assuming operational control under emergency authority," Emma said with a kind of command presence that 15 years of military leadership had developed. "What we're about to attempt is going to violate multiple commercial aviation regulations, but it's also the only way to get everyone aboard this aircraft back to the ground alive." Emma's first priority was stabilizing their glide and maximizing their flight time by configuring the aircraft for optimal unpowered flight characteristics. This required techniques that weren't part of standard airline procedures but were essential for extending the range of an aircraft operating without engine power. "We need to retract the landing gear immediately and configure flaps for minimum drag," Emma instructed, her hands already working the flight controls with a confident precision that combat flying had ingrained. "Then we're going to execute a series of energy management procedures that will extend our glide range and give us more options for emergency landing sites." First Officer Martinez watched in amazement as Emma demonstrated flight techniques that were completely outside his commercial training, but seemed perfectly suited to their aircraft's powerless condition. Her control inputs were precise and purposeful, optimizing their glide performance in ways that standard emergency procedures hadn't addressed. "Colonel Carter, these techniques aren't in any manual I studied," Martinez observed, his professional curiosity overriding his anxiety about their desperate situation. "That's because they're military techniques for combat-damaged aircraft," Emma replied, automatically falling back into the instructional mode that had characterized her later military career when she had been responsible for training younger pilots. Commercial aviation assumes that engine failures will be temporary or partial. Military aviation prepares for situations where aircraft are completely disabled and pilots have to use aerodynamic techniques to reach emergency landing sites. As Emma continued to optimize their flight configuration, she began calculating their option for emergency landing sites based on their current position, altitude, and glide performance. The nearest airports were still beyond their reach using conventional gliding techniques, but Emma's military experience had taught her unconventional approaches that might extend their range enough to reach Midway Atoll, a small Pacific island with a runway that could accommodate large aircraft but required extraordinary precision to approach safely. "We're going to attempt an emergency landing at Midway Island," Emma announced, a decision based on calculations that took into account wind conditions, aircraft performance, and landing techniques that pushed the Boeing 777 beyond its certified operational limits. "It's going to require some unusual procedures, but it's our best chance of getting everyone down safely." What Emma was proposing was an approach profile that had never been attempted by a commercial airliner but was based on techniques she had used to land damaged military aircraft under combat conditions. The approach would require precise energy management, unconventional flight attitudes, and landing procedures that were outside normal Boeing 777 operational parameters. "Colonel, what specific procedures are you planning to use?" Captain Williams asked, recognizing that he was about to participate in flight operations that were beyond his training but trusting Emma's expertise based on her demonstrated knowledge of their aircraft emergency capabilities. Emma outlined approach techniques that combine military emergency procedures with adaptations for the Boeing 777's specific aerodynamic characteristics and structural limitations. "We're going to use a high-energy approach that maintained control authority until the last possible moment, followed by aggressive energy dissipation techniques during touchdown and rollout. It's going to be rough, but everyone will survive if we execute the procedures correctly." As Flight 328 continued its gliding descent toward Midway Island, Emma provided continuous instruction to Captain Williams and First Officer Martinez on the energy management techniques that would be essential for reaching their emergency landing site. Her guidance was proving more effective than standard emergency procedures for managing an aircraft in conditions that commercial aviation training had never anticipated. "The key is understanding that this aircraft is now operating like a military glider rather than a commercial airliner," Emma explained as they descended through 25,000 feet, still gliding steadily toward their distant target. "Every control input has to be calculated for maximum efficiency, and we can't afford to waste energy on standard approach procedures that assume we have engine power available." Captain Williams found himself implementing flying techniques that challenged everything his commercial training had taught him, but which seemed perfectly matched to their aircraft's actual condition and the emergency landing they were attempting. "Colonel Carter, where did you learn these specific gliding techniques?" Emma's response revealed both the scope of her military experience and the personal journey that had brought her to this moment of crisis. "I spent 5 years as a test pilot evaluating emergency procedures for combat-damaged aircraft. Part of that job involved developing techniques for landing aircraft that had lost all power due to battle damage or mechanical failure. I never expected to use those skills on a commercial airliner, but the principles are the same regardless of the aircraft type." As Midway Island appeared on the horizon and Emma began the final approach sequence that would determine whether Flight 328 became a successful emergency landing or a catastrophic crash, she realized that her 3-year attempt to escape from a military identity had been preparation for exactly this moment, when her specialized knowledge and hard-won experience would be the only thing standing between 189 innocent people and certain death in the Pacific Ocean. At 4:47 a.m. Pacific Time, as Midway Atoll appeared on the horizon like a tiny speck of salvation in the vast Pacific Ocean, Emma Carter prepared to attempt something that had never been done in the history of commercial aviation, landing a completely powerless Boeing 777 on a remote island runway using techniques that pushed both aircraft and crew far beyond their certified limitations. Flight 328 was descending through 8,000 feet with Midway Island still 12 miles away, gliding at the edge of its aerodynamic envelope as Emma used every technique she had learned during 15 years of military flying to extract maximum performance from an aircraft that was operating in conditions its designers had never anticipated. "Midway Tower, United 328, Emma transmitted, having assumed primary communication duties from Captain Williams so he could focus entirely on aircraft control. "We are Boeing 777 with dual-engine failure executing emergency unpowered approach to runway 06. We have 189 souls on board and no alternative landing options. Request that all emergency services be positioned for crash landing procedures." The response from Midway's air traffic controller reflected both professional competence and obvious concern about an emergency that was beyond anything in their normal experience. "United 328, Midway Tower. Emergency services are being positioned. Runway 06 is clear. Wind is light and variable. Be advised that our runway length is 7,800 feet, which may be marginal for your aircraft type. Emma had already calculated that the runway length would be barely adequate for their emergency landing, and only if she could execute approach and touchdown procedures that were far outside normal Boeing 777 operational parameters. What she was planning would require precise energy management that left no room for error, and landing techniques that would stress the aircraft structure to its absolute limits. We're going to execute a high-energy approach that maintains flying speed until the last possible moment, Emma explained to Captain Williams and First Officer Martinez as they descended through 5,000 feet with the island growing larger ahead of them. This isn't going to be a normal commercial landing. It's going to be a controlled crash that everyone walks away from if we do it correctly. The approach profile that Emma was executing was based on techniques she had learned for landing damaged military aircraft that had lost normal control authority. Instead of the gradual descent and stabilized approach speeds that commercial procedures required, she was maintaining excess energy and altitude that could be rapidly converted to control inputs if the aircraft behavior became unpredictable. 3 miles from touchdown, altitude 2,400 feet. First Officer Martinez reported, his voice tight with concentration as he monitored their progress toward what appeared to be an impossible landing on a runway that seemed far too small for their massive aircraft. Emma's response demonstrated the kind of split-second decision-making that combat flying had developed. We're committed now. Everything depends on precise execution of touchdown and energy dissipation procedures. Captain Williams, I need you to be ready to assist with maximum braking and thrust reverser deployment the instant we touch down. But as Flight 328 crossed a runway threshold at speeds that were significantly higher than normal landing parameters, Emma encountered a challenge that made powerless aircraft landing so dangerous. Without engine thrust to provide control authority, she had only one attempt to achieve a precise touchdown point and energy dissipation rate that would allow them to stop before running off the end of the runway into the Pacific Ocean. The touchdown was firm and positive, with Emma using techniques that were more crash landing than precision approach to get the aircraft onto the runway's surface with enough energy dissipation to begin the braking process. Captain Williams immediately deployed all available drag devices while Emma maintained directional control, using techniques that pushed the Boeing 777 systems beyond their design limits. Brakes at maximum, thrust reversers deployed. Williams called out as Flight 328 decelerated along Midway's single runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles that were following their progress while prepared for the worst-case scenarios that everyone had expected from an unpowered commercial aircraft landing. We're going to make it, Emma said with quiet satisfaction as their ground speed dropped below critical velocities and it became clear that they would stop before reaching the end of the runway. Everyone aboard this aircraft is going home safely. The emergency evacuation that followed was textbook perfect, with all 189 passengers and crew members exiting the aircraft without serious injuries despite the unprecedented nature of their emergency landing. The successful outcome was a testament to Emma's expertise, the crew's willingness to trust unconventional procedures, and the remarkable fact that a military combat pilot's skills could be adapted to save a commercial airliner under most challenging conditions imaginable. But even as passengers celebrated their survival and emergency responders confirmed that everyone had escaped serious harm, Emma Carter was dealing with the psychological impact of having her carefully constructed civilian identity completely destroyed by circumstances that had forced her to become Colonel Phoenix Carter once again. As she walked away from Flight 328, surrounded by passengers who were beginning to understand that their survival had depended on the military expertise of someone they had assumed was just another business traveler, Emma realized that her 3-year attempt to escape from her past had been preparation for exactly this moment, when her specialized knowledge became the difference between mass tragedy and miraculous survival. The impossible had become routine through the application of skill that Emma had tried to leave behind, and the woman who had entered Flight 328 as a logistics consultant was walking away as the pilot who had achieved one of the most remarkable emergency landings in aviation history. Within hours of Flight 328's miraculous emergency landing at Midway Atoll, word of the unprecedented save had spread throughout the aviation and military communities, triggering responses that revealed the true scope of Emma Carter's previous identity and the significance of what she had accomplished using skill that most people assumed belonged only to her past. The first indication that Emma's civilian cover had been completely blown came when a formation of 4 F-22 Raptors appeared over Midway Island, executing a precision flyover that was clearly intended as a salute to the pilot who had achieved the impossible. As the advanced fighters passed overhead in tight formation, their pilots transmitted a message that was heard by everyone on the emergency response frequency. "Phoenix, this is Viper Flight," came the voice of the lead F-22 pilot, using call signs and communication protocols that immediately identified the formation as active-duty Air Force personnel. Outstanding save. The entire fighter community sends their respect for bringing everyone home safely. Welcome back to the fight. Emma stood on Midway's tarmac watching the F-22 formation disappear toward the horizon, feeling emotions that she hadn't experienced since leaving the Air Force 3 years earlier. The recognition from her former community was both gratifying and painful. Gratifying because it acknowledged the extraordinary skill she had demonstrated, but painful because it reminded her of the sense of purpose and belonging that she had sacrificed when she chose civilian life over continued military service. Captain Williams and First Officer Martinez, whose lives had been saved by Emma's expertise, approached her with expressions that reflected both professional admiration and personal gratitude for her intervention during their crisis. "Colonel Carter," Captain Williams said, using her military rank despite her civilian status, "what you did today was beyond anything I learned in 23 years of commercial flying. You saved everyone aboard the aircraft using techniques that I didn't know existed." Emma's response reflected the complexity of her feelings about being forced back into the identity she had been trying to escape. "Captain Williams, I'm not a colonel anymore. I'm a logistics consultant who happened to have some relevant experience when you needed help. What happened today doesn't change the fact that I chose to leave military service for reasons that were important to me." But even as Emma tried to maintain the boundaries between her past and present identities, the investigation of Flight 328's engine failure and emergency landing was revealing details that made it impossible for her to remain anonymous or return to her civilian life as if nothing had happened. The dual-engine failure had been caused by a manufacturing defect that had affected multiple aircraft in the Boeing 777 fleet, and Emma's successful emergency landing provided crucial data about how similar emergencies could be managed using techniques that weren't part of standard airline training. Aviation safety officials needed her expertise to develop new emergency procedures that could save lives if other aircraft experienced similar failures. More significantly, the military personnel who had known Emma during her Air Force career were beginning to emerge from the classified world where her achievements had been hidden from public view. Her former squadron mates, commanding officers, and the pilots she had trained were sharing stories that revealed the true scope of her contributions to American air power and the reasons why her call sign Phoenix had become legendary within the fighter pilot community. "Emma Carter didn't just save Flight 328. Explained Brigadier General Sarah Mitchell, Emma's former wing commander, during a press conference that revealed previously classified details about Emma's military service. She spent 15 years developing and testing the emergency procedures that saved 189 lives yesterday. Her techniques for flying combat-damaged aircraft have been incorporated into training programs that have saved dozens of military pilots over the past decade. The revelation of Emma's true background created a media sensation that made it impossible for her to return to her anonymous civilian life, but it also opened opportunities that she hadn't expected. The Air Force, which had never wanted to lose such an exceptional pilot, began approaching her about returning to service in roles that would utilize her unique combination of combat experience, test pilot expertise, and proven ability to develop training programs that saved lives. "Colonel Carter," said General Patricia Rodriguez, the current commander of Air Combat Command, during a secure phone call to Midway Island, "the Air Force needs officers with your experience and expertise. We're developing new training programs for emergency procedures and advanced flight techniques, and we need someone who understands both the technical requirements and the psychological demands of flying in impossible conditions." Emma's response reflected her evolving understanding of how the skills she had tried to abandon were actually an integral part of her identity and purpose. General Rodriguez, "I left the Air Force because I was no longer certain that my skills were being used for purposes that aligned with my values. But what happened today reminded me that these skills can save innocent lives regardless of the political or strategic context in which they applied." The conversation continued with details about Air Force programs that would allow Emma to use her expertise for training and education rather than direct combat operations, positions that would utilize her technical knowledge while aligning with her desire to protect innocent lives rather than engage in potentially ambiguous military actions. As Emma considered the possibility of returning to military service in a capacity that focused on education and safety rather than combat operations, she realized that her 3 years in civilian life hadn't been an escape from her military identity. They had been preparation for understanding how her specialized skills could be applied in ways that clearly served humanitarian purposes rather than potentially controversial strategic objectives. 6 months after the miraculous landing of Flight 328 at Midway Atoll, Colonel Emma Phoenix Carter stood before a classroom of young Air Force pilots at Nellis Air Force Base, wearing the uniform she had thought she would never put on again and preparing to teach emergency procedures that had been developed from her own harrowing experiences with aircraft that were damaged, powerless, or operating far beyond their design limitations. The decision to return to military service hadn't been immediate or easy. Emma had spent weeks after the Midway landing trying to reconcile her reason for leaving the Air Force with the undeniable reality that her skills were uniquely valuable for protecting innocent lives. The media attention had made it impossible to return to her anonymous civilian career, but more importantly, the experience of saving Flight 328 had reminded her of the deep satisfaction that came from using her expertise in service of something greater than her own comfort or moral certainty. The position that General Rodriguez had offered was perfect for Emma's evolved understanding of how her military skills could be applied. As Director of Advanced Emergency Procedures Training, she would be responsible for developing and teaching courses that prepared pilots to handle aircraft emergencies that were outside normal training parameters, exactly the kind of situations where her unique combination of combat experience, test pilot background, and proven ability to innovate under pressure could save lives without requiring her to participate in combat operations that might conflict with her personal values. The techniques I'm going to teach you weren't developed in simulators or training programs. Emma began her first lecture to a class of 24 experienced pilots who had been selected for advanced emergency training. They were developed in real aircraft under real emergency conditions by pilots who had to innovate or die. Some of these procedures will seem to violate everything you learned in primary flight training, but they work because they are based on understanding aircraft performance at the edges of the flight envelope where normal rules no longer apply. The curriculum that Emma had developed was based on scenarios that reflected the full range of aircraft emergencies that military pilots might encounter, from combat damage to mechanical failures to situations like Flight 328 where multiple systems failed simultaneously. Her teaching methodology emphasized practical problem-solving under extreme stress rather than memorization procedural checklists that might not be adequate for unprecedented situations. Emergency flying is about making rapid decisions with incomplete information while managing aircraft that are behaving in ways you've never experienced before, Emma explained as she led her students through simulator exercises that recreated the conditions she had faced above the Pacific. You have to trust your instincts while applying technical knowledge that goes beyond what any manual or checklist can provide. The success of Emma's training program was measured not just in student feedback and test scores, but in the lives that were saved when graduates applied her techniques in real emergency situations. Within the first year of the program, 3 separate incidents had been resolved successfully by pilots who used procedures that Emma had taught them for handling aircraft that were damaged or disabled beyond the scope of normal emergency training. But perhaps the most significant validation of Emma's return to military service came when she received a letter from Captain Williams and the passengers of Flight 328, who had tracked her down to express their gratitude for not just saving their lives, but for choosing to use her experience to train others who might face similar emergencies. Colonel Carter, the letter read, "We understand that your decision to return to the Air Force means that you will be training pilots who may save other people the way you saved us. Thank you for choosing to share your knowledge instead of keeping it private. Your skills are too valuable to waste on corporate consulting when they could be protecting innocent lives." The letter was accompanied by a photograph of the 189 passengers and crew members of Flight 328, taken during a reunion that had been organized to celebrate the first anniversary of their survival. The image showed people of all ages who were alive because Emma had chosen to act when others needed her expertise, and who understood that her return to military service represented a commitment to protecting others who might find themselves in similar desperate situations. Emma's office at Nellis was decorated with mementos that reflected both her past achievements and her current mission. Her original Phoenix squadron patch was displayed alongside commendations from the passengers of Flight 328, while a desk held technical manuals for aircraft that didn't exist when she had first learned to fly but whose emergency procedures were being developed using principles she had established through her own experiences with the impossible. The thing about being called Phoenix is that it implies the ability to rise from destruction and be reborn into something more capable than what existed before. Emma explained to a journalist who was writing about military pilots who had transitioned between combat and training roles. I thought leaving the Air Force meant leaving that identity behind, but what I learned from Flight 328 is that the identity follows you regardless of what uniform you wear or what job title appears on your business cards. She continued with reflections that captured her evolved understanding of how military skills could serve humanitarian purposes. The techniques I developed for flying damaged fighters in combat zones turned out to be exactly what was needed to save a commercial airliner full of innocent civilians. The connection between protecting people in wartime and protecting people in peacetime is more direct than I had realized when I left military service. As Emma prepared for her next class of students, pilots who would learn from her experience and potentially save lives using techniques that she had paid for with years of dangerous flying, she understood that her journey from combat pilot to civilian consultant to military instructor had been preparation for exactly this mission, using her unique skills and hard-won knowledge to protect innocent people regardless of whether they were fellow military personnel or civilian passengers on a commercial airliner. The woman who had tried to escape from her identity as Phoenix had discovered that some callings transcend career choices and personal preferences, and that the most important service often involves teaching others to carry on missions are too important to depend on any single individual, no matter how skilled or experienced they might be. Standing before her students and preparing to teach them how to bring disabled aircraft and endangered people home safely, Emma Carter had found her true calling, not as a warrior, but as someone who created warriors who protected innocent lives when the impossible became necessary and heroes emerged from the most unexpected places. This story reminds us that running from our calling often leads us exactly where we need to be when the world needs our unique gifts most. Emma's journey from combat pilot to civilian refugee to military instructor demonstrates that our deepest skills and strongest convictions find ways to serve others regardless of the career paths we choose or the identities we try to construct. Sometimes the people we're meant to become can only be discovered by first trying to become someone else, and sometimes saving lives requires not just courage and skill, but the wisdom to understand that our greatest contributions come from teaching others to carry on missions that are bigger than any individual achievement. What did you think of Emma's story? Rate it from 1 to 10, and let us know where you're listening from. Thank you for watching and sharing this moment with us.